So, welcome to those who've joined us. I see Andrea and Simon. What we're doing is reading a text called On Touching. So, if you have anybody that you can sit next to or see the text, we were, as you can see, working out the miracles of quantum field theory in order to come back to art. So, we're going to continue to read this and discuss it, and then in the final session have some more stories.
Yes.
But at any point, if you want to say something or add things, apart from the difficulty of having to have this object, do say so, because we've probably kept you in enthrallment so far, but words need to come out of everybody's mouths if they wish to ask questions. Is that okay? You all feel empowered to say, I don't get that, or I'm not getting this, or whatever. Okay? So hand back to Carolyn.
Thank you. Good. So we had arrived at the point where Karen Barad is going to discuss touching no longer from the perspective of classical physics, where touching is actually not touching but resisting touching because of the particle charges of the electrons that resist each other. And now we're going to go out of that into her way of seeing it, touching from her experience in quantum physics as a physicist herself. Now, where were we? For now, I simply note pace Democritus. Is that where we were?
Yes.
Okay. So, for now, I simply note pace Democritus, that particles no longer take their place in the void. Rather, they are constitutively entangled with it. As for the void, it is no longer vacuous. It is a living, breathing indeterminacy of non-being. That's the subject of her, of the other text you have, the notebook, which is about how the void is full and empty, and it's not empty at the same time. The vacuum is a jubilant exploration of virtuality, where virtual virtual particles, whose identifying characteristic is not rapidity, despite the common tale explaining that they are particles that go in and out of the vacuum faster than their existence can be detected, which would explain why they're non-being, but they're there but not there. So the common tale is to say that they're so fast, they're sort of not there, but rather indeterminacy, as having a field day performing experiments in being and time. That is, virtuality is a kind of thought experiment the world performs. So this is an amazing idea. Yeah. Yes. It's nice that they say a field, what were you saying? Field?
Well, she said field day because she's
Yes.
talking about field there. It's just lovely
Yes.
the way she uses language.
Yes.
Particles are having a field day. So.
Yes, and a field day in normal speech is going out of the class to go into a field of experimenting, like,
Yeah.
okay, or a field trip is what? What's a field trip?
Field trip.
A field trip.
Well, it implies more than that. It also implies a special day as a more kind of everyday term. It means it's actually just having a field day
Is a day off
a
also.
day off, well, yeah, a day off or a day of pleasure.
Yes. So what she's saying here is that virtual particles, which need to exist for the theory of quantum to work, and are somehow virtual and therefore not there, they are necessary, and they are there because it is the relationship between the virtual particles and the non-virtual particles that makes the quantum field, right? So in a way, she's saying that virtuality, or these virtual particles in quantum, are a little bit like thought experiments that we do as opposed to laboratory empirical experiments, but that then can maybe be done experimentally as well as just doing them as the maths, as were thought experiments. So this goes back to what she was saying at the beginning, that the world does theory, that what we consider like theory is something that actually is done by all sorts of sentient beings of the world. The world is also thinking itself as it's making itself. Virtual particles do not traffic in a metaphysics of presence. They do not exist in space and time. They are ghostly non-existences that teeter on the edge of the infinitely fine blade between being and non-being. So she's slowly dismantling this idea. She's dismantling on the level of physics itself the idea that there's a duality, a kind of mind-body division between being and non-being. Admittedly, virtuality is difficult to grasp. The use of the word ghostly, I think, is very interesting because why? Does anyone else find it interesting? The ghostly. I mean, for me, it's associated with a lot of different things. For example, Ghostly Matters by the book by, we mentioned her last night. Avery Gordon wrote Ghostly Matters, and the history of the relationship with the ghostly in feminism, for example, in Gothic novels from the 18th century onwards. I mean, it associates with many things to me, the ghostly. But also the ghostly is somehow something that we conjure up as being neither being nor non-being, but in some presence that is in between, a sort of. And it made me think right now of last night I was speaking with someone about the image, and if the image exists beyond the fact that someone is imagining an image or seeing an image. And one would think not, because there's some sort of real and then there's the representation of the real that's the image. But if you put a mirror in front of a plant in a room and there's no person there and there's a certain quantity of light, then there will be something going on in that mirror that you could call an image, even though nobody is looking at it. And so it is a kind of ghostly matter, and it is made up of materiality as well. I mean, light is made up of materiality as well. So this ghostly existence that teeters on the edge of the infinitely fine blade between being and non-being is a nice sentence. Admittedly, virtuality is difficult to grasp. Indeed, this is its very nature. To put it concisely, virtual particles are quantized indeterminacies in action. Now, there's a note, footnote 9. For an accessible introductory treatment of quantum field theory, especially with regard to its understanding of the vacuum and virtuality, see Barad, What is the Measure of Nothingness? And that text, What is the Measure of Nothingness, is, I believe, the Documenta notebook, actually.
Is it?
Isn't it? Let's have a look. In the Barad text that I gave you, unless she wrote another thing called What is the Measure of Nothingness?
It might be.
I think it is. You have it in your reader. Okay. Good. Okay. Which is another really strange time loop that's going on, because we're reading an article by Karen Barad, which was someone who influenced my thinking through her other books for the Documenta, but this article is written after, and she's referring to the publication she made for the Documenta. So for me, it's a very interesting time warp, kind of, about the way we know things, because the way that I know things is she comes before, not after. It's interesting. So the next paragraph is Troubling Matters, Infinities, Perversities, Hauntings. Troubling matters. Okay. When it comes to quantum field theory, it is not difficult to find trouble. It is not so much that trouble is around every corner. According to quantum field theory, it inhabits us and we inhabit it, or rather, trouble inhabits everything and nothing, matter and the void. So that reminds me of Donna Haraway's when she says staying with the rubble and being in the troubles. The zone between, when she speaks in her books, When Species Meet, about dogs, humans, and significant otherness, or even in the Cyborg Manifesto, she speaks of that area that is not the technological and not the bodily, but that gray zone of the troubled area in between. And if you think about dogs, they are both non-human, but they are also co-evolving. Actually, it's an interesting intra-action, the so-called dog and the so-called human, because we could argue that there were no humans before dogs and there were no dogs before humans, because in some way there's a co-evolution. There might have been some sort of ancestor of wolf and or dog in some sort of wolf types, and some sort of ancestor of us. But there are no cemeteries with bones that have human settlements without dog bones in the same settlement. So this is a very interesting trajectory. Yeah?
How does, for example, Deleuze and Guattari's becoming animal?
Yes, very badly. It sits very badly with me. And it sits very badly with this way of thinking. It's a long story. So you want my opinion, obviously. Yes, because there is no objectivity in this, obviously. I think that Deleuze uses this devenir animal coming from Nietzsche, right? So Nietzsche has this question of vitality, and the question of becoming animal is something that he even speaks about in Ecce Homo, in his last book, although very briefly. And Deleuze got it wrong. My friend Vinciane Després, feminist ethologist, philosopher as well, who lives and works in Belgium, and who is one of the most knowledgeable people that I know about human, non-human relations within scientific fields or within work fields. So she is studying, for example, the relations between farmers and pigs, or looks at the rat and the scientist in the experimental lab with rats and so on. And she notices through her interviews and quote-unquote field research and so on, that often there are cases where the rats are teaching the scientists what they're supposed to do, that like an older one will be kind of helping to how to do it right. So this providing agency to the non-human animal is a way of arriving at then animal rights, not through paternalism or animal protectionism, but through the idea of not othering the other and therefore providing agency to the other. Now, all of this discussion does not go through Deleuze. Deleuze is not interested in that. I think Deleuze sees a contrast between the bourgeois society and the so-called pack. What he uses the word pack in that chapter that, when he's speaking about the wolves. And he's somehow idealizing this non-bourgeois society that would have this ability to be part of the pack and out of the pack, to be autonomous and within. And he uses the omega wolf actually as an example of that, but he doesn't call it omega wolf. And he got it wrong because in those years they didn't realize that behavior of wolves was only the behavior of wolves in captivity. So wolves that are not in captivity were not studied in the 70s and 80s. And there was no knowledge that, for example, they have mostly nuclear families, 5-6, they live 5-6 together, and the wolf, when the wolf becomes a little bit adult, the wolf will leave the family and found a new family somewhere else. Whereas in captivity, they become groups of much more, 12, 18, 20, because they are unable, he was using the studies from the Pyrenees of the wolves, and they are unable in those, I only know this because Vinciane told me this. I mean, I don't, and studied this question. And in the Pyrenees, it looks like it's wild, but it's not a so-called wild environment. And what is a wild environment? But let's say it's a captive environment. And in the captive environment, they will stick together. They will not be able to found nucleus of new, small, more nuclear family type situations. So they become the pack. And then they will always create the omega wolf, the one wolf that is on the edge, stays away from the group, kind of in and kind of out, and that usually is killed and battered and mistreated by the others. If you take the omega wolf out, it will be reconstructed. They will make another omega wolf so it's a kind of a sign of a traumatic condition of lack of freedom of wolves that paradoxically was identified with the behavior of wolves in the idealized animal, of the devenir animal. And in that chapter, he also lashes out in a very violent way against the Freud and Freud's reading of the little story of the wolf man. And he says that Freud only knew his puppy and his dog in his house. And of course, that is an alarming moment because it is a typical patriarchal way of, I mean, of course, there are situations that are absurd of infantilizing non-human animals in pet situations where the animal is not challenged in training to use the brain and to work and play in an intelligent way. So they're infantilized in ways that are kept like in, wrapping a baby and just taken out to pee with a leash. So for me, the problem is more the leash and also the legislation around leashes than the problem of being with dogs. So Deleuze's kind of hatred of the dog and love of the wolf is, I think, a very naive kind of 68, pensée 68 in its worst way, in its worst version. But it doesn't mean that there aren't wonderful things that I love about Deleuze's Mille Plateaux. I mean, but that is not one.
It was just that idea of becoming, obviously, that they use across strata, and obviously they're also the very controversial one, becoming woman, that has been challenged very much.
Yeah.
By people like Barad, etc.
Absolutely. And in that chapter, he speaks about the flying vaginas. Remember?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
I mean, it gets
I think we can get off of Deleuze.
Times,
yeah.
yes.
But why were we there anyway? Oh, the troubles, because of the dog question. Yes, this is a very interesting, it reminded me of Donna Haraway's Staying with the Rubble and Staying with the Troubles, and these troubled zones where you cannot really distinguish what is the so-called human intervention in the existence of the peach, and the peach making us, or us making the peach. You know, there were no peaches either until there was grafting of certain, plants and nurturing them in certain ways so that the fruit over centuries and centuries actually developed the way that we know it, and continues to change in the ways that farmers continue to change and modify the food that they grow. So a kind of grassroots genetic modification is farming per se. And so this has nothing to do with this article, though, so I think we should go back. But I was the one who did it, so thank you for the question, to go off, because it just reminded me to Staying with the Trouble, and Donna's speaking about not eschewing the problem of that area of, I mean, the dog is there because the dog is part of civilization, and it is part of the urban environment and the farming environment, and they are human in a way, but they are also making us human. I mean, and a paradoxical story that I always tell people, which is wrong, it's false historically, but I like to say it in terms of speculative fabulation, is that it's wrong because there's a long time between the bones of dogs and the bones of humans found in all stationary settlements around the world. It goes back to when there is no more nomads, right? So it actually has to do with maybe 10,000, 13,000 BC, not more. But I like to tell the story that is wrong because temporally it's much before. That somehow the dog comes when the human stands up and wants to compensate a loss of ability. So it's a part of sharing and coevolution. So the mapping of a space, or the memory and knowledge you get from the smell, which you don't have if you're not down on your fours that much anymore, you compensate the way. So it's a kind of prosthetic device that was made, and the same as our cell phones and so on, and how we co-evolve with these nature cultures that we develop, which also causes the loss of certain abilities at the same time, because it then increases the loss of being able to smell, because if you then never go down and smell because you have the dog with you, then it even increases that problem that you're trying to compensate with the technology that you've invented, like so on. But to go back to this, the troubles. We have to read.
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
One moment, because there's two. Yeah, I need
Two dogs.
two dog stories.
Oh.
You just need to add into this. One is they're doing contemporary research now on the fact that dogs can smell the presence of deadly diseases in bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So they're using dogs diagnostically to identify cancers that are
Absolutely.
subclinical
Yes.
through this extraordinary question of smell. And the other thing, which is about Freud, was Freud took his own life at the point at which his dogs could no longer bear to smell him because of the nature of his cancer, the poison in his mouth. And when he felt that the dogs could not bear to be near him, he decided.
That's very interesting. It's also, again, a kind of intra-dying, living and dying together.
Yeah.
Sharing suffering. One of the chapters of Donna Haraway's book is called Sharing Suffering, parting bites and sharing suffering, eating each other and dying together and so on. So that's a really beautiful dog story, which I guess did not know. So the troubles, staying with the troubles. How does quantum field theory understand the nature of the electron, or any other particle for that matter? So here we are, we're going to learn. It turns out that even the simplest particle, a point particle, devoid of structure, like the electron, causes all kinds of difficulties for quantum field theory. To be fair, one of the problems is already evident in classical field theory. A bit of background on the electron. Immediately after its discovery, in the 19th century, physicists did not assume that the electron was a point particle. They imagined it to be a tiny sphere. However, if you think of an electron as a tiny spherical entity with bits of negative charge distributed on its surface, and remember that like charges repel one another, then you can see the intractable difficulty that arises from this model. All the bits of negative charge distributed on the surface of the sphere repel one another. So it would explode if it was a sphere. Like our pot that was cooked without a hole, but it had a hole. So it didn't explode. And since there is no positive unlike charge around to mitigate the mutual repulsion each bit feels, the electron's own electromagnetic self-energy would be too much to bear. It would blow itself apart. Such stability issues pointed to the need for a better understanding of the electron's structure. In 1925, the Russian physicist Yakov Ilyich Frenkel, that's not Frankel, but Frenkel, offered a different proposal. The electron is a negatively charged point particle. That is, the electron has no substructure. In this way, he eliminated the difficulty of the mutual repulsion of bits of charges distributed on the surface, because there were no bits of charge here and there, just a single point carrying a negative charge. But the attempt to push one instability away just produced another. For if the electron is a point particle, and therefore has zero radius, then the self-energy contribution, that is, the interaction of the particle with the surrounding electromagnetic field that it creates, is infinite. Frenkel believed that this paradox could only be resolved using quantum theory. Not only did the infinities persist when quantum field theory tried to resolve the problem, they multiplied. Here we go into one of the two schools of physics, of quantum. Indeed, infinities are now accepted as an integral part of the theory. Marks of self-interaction, the trace of the inseparability of particle and void. Specifically, the electron's self-energy takes the form of an electron exchanging a virtual photon, the quantum of the electromagnetic field, with itself. This is why you say that it's kind of a strange queering of theory also. It's interesting. Richard Feynman, one of the key authors of quantum field theory, frames the difficulty in explicitly moral terms. Instead of going directly from one point to another, the electron goes along for a while and suddenly emits a photon. Then, horrors, it absorbs its own photon. Perhaps there's something immoral about that, but the electron does it.
Like a police car.
A police car?
It always reminds me of a police car. Struggling along there, it goes, no, 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 no.
But then it doesn't absorb its own.
Goes back again.
Oh, yeah. But that would be turning on and off. Hence, the infinity associated with electron self-energy and other related infinities wind up installed. This is so fantastic that this happened.
We all were so still.
Why?
We weren't moving.
Wind up installed in quantum. It just reabsorbed the photon for us. The infinite photons. Wind up installed in quantum field theory as intrinsic perversions. Let's look at number 10 note. The moral fabric of the theory and the particles whose behaviors it purports to explain are widely questioned in quantum field theory. To offer a couple of additional examples, Kaiser takes note of common references to the, quote, sickness, unquote, of quantum field theory, to the virtual particles as, quote, naughty school children. So, apparently, touching oneself or being touched by oneself, the ambiguity, undecidability, indeterminacy may itself be the key to the trouble, is not simply troubling, but a moral violation, the very source of all trouble. The electron is not merely causing trouble for us. In an important sense, it is troubling itself, or rather its self, as we will soon see. That is, the very notion of itself, of identity, is radically queered. Gender trouble for sure, but that isn't the half of it. Then there is the question of whether what is really at issue is not touching oneself per se, but rather the possibility of touching itself. This is a bit Heideggerian. The issue arises in quantum field theory in the following way. The electron emits a photon that, quote, makes a positron-electron pair. And, again, if you'll hold your moral objections, the electron and positron annihilate, creating a new photon that is ultimately absorbed by the electron, writes Feynman. Note 11. According to quantum field theory, most kinds of particles have corresponding antiparticles, that is, particles with the same mass and opposite charge. For example, positrons are antimatter electrons. When positrons and electrons meet, they annihilate each other, producing photons. The reverse process can also occur. Photons can turn into positron-electron pairs or other kinds of particle-antiparticle pairs. Real particle interactions must conserve energy, but this is not the case for virtual particle interactions. I suppose this is a development after many, many years of the fact that light can be both particle and wave in a way. I mean, this kind of indeterminacy and uncertainty in its, this is my imagination, but in its developments would end up turning into a situation like this.
I was just going to say, one thing that's always struck me about this are two things, which is that if you go on the question of what did scientists have to do in order to be able to jump out of certain paradigms for understanding the world, which were based on these Newtonian stabilities, which are also based on the same philosophy system, is that there's something stable enough for somebody to observe and thought to be the work of analysis of this object. And obviously when we first started moving into post-structuralism and had to deal with the destabilizing or the undoing, the deconstruction of the security of a binary which would have
this subject knowing this object.
The subject, object, etc. It was perfectly possible to enter into it, but of course we know that when the scientists started off, they were reading James Joyce, or they borrowed Quark. They had this thing, and then I remember there was a famous television program about 20 or 30 years ago when most of you weren't around, but I was still watching television in that arcana. But it was really about the relationship between microphysics and astrophysics, and it was one of those wonderful kind of moments where very high-powered people explained something of these two levels
Yes.
in which people were trying to think what,
Yes, the
what
edge of the black
holes
hole, the
and all of
string
that stuff,
theory,
and then
and
actually
then
this level and quarks
Yes.
and charms and all the rest of it, and just thought you could only make sense of it if you have a capacity to enter
Yes.
into thought through poetics. If you stick with, the kind of terms of thinking, I don't understand, how can this be and this not be?
Rationalism.
Rationalism, or even certain kinds of logic. But you still think to yourself, what kind of people are they if they go to work every day? This is what they have to kind of, they're literally inhabiting this kind of universe with a certain level of these brilliant Bright-Af type machines that are produced for the testing out of this. I mean, like the accelerator.
Yes,
and
yes,
then they
in
finally say, we
Geneva. Yes.
hypothesize for years and years there's got to be this, whatever it is, this thing they've just discovered at CERN. Yes, and where do they get that name for it? It's just extraordinary. And yet, of course, I'm sure all of us are reading this with that feeling that it literally, quote, is touching on certain kinds of things which become the substance of art making, to which we've given other sorts of names, but require, which are not the same, but require us to enter into something where things can be this and that.
Yes, but I don't know if the word to use is poetics. I mean, if I were to be speaking with Anton Zellinger about this question, he would probably say more complexity and multiplicity. So there is a very strong reasoning going on in quantum labs. I was trying to get a picture of his studio, his lab, because it's all, it's all lenses, mirrors, optical devices, and wires. But I here to show you Anton Zellinger's place, because we're talking about the scientists, but we're also talking about feminist studies being in the lab, situated studies, material studies. So let's look at, if I can find Zellinger pictures, what it looks like, because it's very interesting to see what it looks like. So you can see his notebooks. Just these are this is not what I wanted to show you, but it certainly gives you the sense that he's using reasoning. It's not like, but poetics doesn't mean not reasoning. But there is a lot of reasoning going on there. These are his notebooks for when he figured out how to transform the Gedanken experiment, the thought experiment, into an actual embodied experiment of photon entanglement, which is the big shift was when we could move out of the theory of quantum physics into the actual seeing it, how it works in the world. And then the next step is to see that the world is doing this. The world is theorizing and thinking and telling him how to do it. That's Anton. Oh, that's the entrance door to his institute. That's his desk, or it's a sort of staged one, but that's actually the institute in Vienna. Okay, that's a good picture. That's what it looks like. That is not the art student, it's the quantum physicist, and that's what they spend their day doing. They make all these like ricochet of little with laser, and then they split the photons, and then they entangle them in different ways, like entangled for color. For example, if something is one color, then the other one reacts in a connected way. These are people in his lab, and those are the things that are in his lab. Okay, that's enough, I guess, just to give you that sense, I hope, that we go back to, well, to the sense that I think he would answer. It's a question of the ability to hold contradictory things, or apparently contradictory things, and very complex things in one's practice and in one's mind, as opposed to the idea that there is pure some sort of fantasy going on. Yeah. But I think that it's true very much what, as we said earlier today, that science is scienced by the world, and so that it is as much providing models for us to fantasize on, or tell stories with, or imagine with, or act with, or live with, or die with, as much as it is the result of the, I guess, historical, economic, political, social, and environmental times that then allows to see the world in a way or in a different way. So that's also an interaction going on. So we were at this business of touching itself. Okay, so in fact there is an infinite number of such possibilities, or what physicists also refer to as an infinite sum over all possible histories. The electron not only exchanges a virtual photon with itself, it is possible for that virtual photon to enjoy other interactions with itself. For example, it can vanish, turning itself into a virtual electron-positron pair whose terms subsequently annihilate each other before turning back into the virtual photon, before it is absorbed by the electron. So dances, frenetic dances within dances of matter, mattering itself. Someone asked me if I was like a New Age person once after talking about these things. Now, I see nothing wrong with New Age, actually. I mean, New Age of the 70s was simply one iteration of something that goes back to theosophy. There's nothing wrong with Madame Blavatsky and reading all of that, and Rudolf Steiner, and why not, you know? We can go backwards. But I think it was a kind of an insult or something. But anyway, there is something a bit related to early religions, to early pre-monotheistic religions in all of this, a kind of Buddhist vision of matter and the way matter circulates that is going on. And in fact, it's very interesting that the Dalai Lama wanted to meet Anton Zellinger, and Anton Zellinger went to meet the Dalai Lama during the years that we were preparing the Documenta. And when he came back, I said, what did he say? You know, and I think he brought Anna Bogigian with him, because Anna Bogigian heard that the Dalai Lama wanted to meet, and so they went to India. And she's part of this story, this entangled story of Documenta. And the Dalai Lama basically said that they think the same things, but that Anton doesn't know why. Why it is the way it is. Okay, so back to this business. And so on. This is, where are we? Oh yeah, and so on. This quote, and so on, unquote, is shorthand for an infinite set of possibilities involving every possible kind of interaction. She uses the word interaction here, with every possible kind of virtual particle it can interact with. I don't know why she does, but she's now, yes, she does, because she's now speaking about two things that actually exist. They are not coming into the world in the moment of their interaction, but they're actually existing and then interacting, absorbing each other, itself. That is, there is a virtual exploration of every possibility. And this infinite set of possibilities, or infinite sum of histories, entails a particle touching itself, and then that touching itself, and so on, ad infinitum. Every level of touch, then, is itself touched by all possible others. Hence, self-touching is an encounter with the infinite alterity of the self. Matter is an enfolding, an involution. So she uses the word that she takes from others. I think she quotes it also. It cannot help touching itself, and in this self-touching it comes in contact with the infinite alterity that it is. Polymorphous perversity raised to an infinite power, talking about a queer intimacy. What is being called into question here is the very nature of the self, and in terms of not just being, but also time. That is, in an important sense, the self is dispersed, diffracted through time and being. The problem of self-touching, especially self-touching the other, this is a beautiful concept, I think. Because indeed, when we touch the other, we are also touching ourselves. And I think even Levinas is writing that. Not Levinas. I think there is something in Levinas about touching and the limits of touching. But I mean, I meant now the Merleau-Ponty that you're referring to, that touching the other is touching oneself and so on. And in terms of touching not others but things, there's that famous Sartre speaking about phenomenology in philosophy, in existentialism, when he writes about touching the bridge in Paris and this experience of touching this matter of which the, not banister, but the edge of the bridge is. Polymorphous, so where were the problem of self-touching, especially self-touching the other, is a perversity of quantum field theory that goes far deeper than we can touch on here. The gist of it, this perversity that is at the root of an unwanted infinity that threatens the very possibility of calculability, gets that threatening the very possibility of calculability is when you extend it all the way to what you were talking about, the black holes and the string theory and what happens, what teeters on the edge of the black hole. So that threatens the very possibility of calculability gets renormalized. What? The gist of it. This perversity that is at the root of an unwanted infinity that threatens the very possibility of calculability gets renormalized. Obviously, should we expect anything else? How does this happen? It turns out that there are two different kinds of infinities, perversions involved. Most of the focus in quantum field theory is on the perversion of self-touching. But there is another that has to do with the nakedness. Nakedness. That brings us to her referring to l'animal que donc je suis in the title of this essay, because in l'animal que donc je suis, Derrida speaks and starts it off with what does the cat think of me when I'm naked in front of the cat. And I, of course, would say, I don't think the cat thinks anything in particular, nor do I really care about what the cat thinks about me when I'm naked as opposed to dressed. But on a deeper level, it could be a really interesting question, actually, if the cat is understanding the nakedness or not of the other. It could be interesting, but he doesn't bring it to that in the Derrida text. I think he's bringing it to providing the other with agency and dismantling the human exceptionalism of philosophy up to then, which, as we now have discussed, is actually only the human exceptionalism of the philosophy determined by what was philosophy and excluding the non-human exceptionalist philosophy, which is contained in ethology. So it's a kind of a paradox. But this is where she speaks, why she speaks about, uses that title, I think. So we're now going into a question of nakedness. In particular, and at the beginning of the essay, you may notice that she used the word bare and barely grazed the surface. So I think there's actually a very interesting textual analysis that could be made of this text if one were to look at it as a piece of literature. Very beautiful way that the words come and go and then diffract and refract and infract. So in particular, there is an infinity associated with the bare point particle. That is, with the perverse assumption we started with, that there is only an electron, the undressed bare electron, and the void. Now this, what I'm doing right now, has nothing to do with this text. It's one of those distractions. I think that we talked about distraction yesterday, trajer in another direction. What comes to my mind now is Agamben and bare, the bare self, or bare life, and the misunderstandings of bare life also that were made in many readings of Agamben's text, but also that when Agamben speaks about the non-human in l'aperto, in the open, I think there are a lot of problems. So maybe next institute we can bring that text. There are a lot of problems because he actually is referring to the non-human animal in the same text where he speaks about bare life and the slave and the freedom and so on, in the way that Heidegger used the animal as not knowing that it is a kind of life without knowing, without language, and without knowing that we shall die. And this kind of lack of awareness that would define the kind of bare animality. But at the same time, he speaks about Uexkul in Agamben does, and Deleuze does not. I don't think Deleuze, I'm not sure, but this might be wrong, but I don't think Deleuze quotes his sources fully. He takes a lot from a man called Uexkul, that we shall read in the next one, who was the founder of ethology, basically, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and who spoke about the Umwelt of each type of insect or animal or life form, And so that we mustn't compare the intelligence of the tick with the intelligence of a human, because each has their own Umwelt, and you can only measure it within that world. Which is true and false, because there's an interaction of all the Umwelts, and there's a constant reconstruction of the Umwelts. But this idea of the Umwelt actually gave birth to the kind of respect towards the worldview of the different sentient beings, whether it's a cell or a microbe or a worm, or that brought to the respectful work of ethology. And Deleuze, and he speaks a lot about the tick and the spider, and Deleuze speaks a lot about the tick and the spider, but I don't think he quotes Uexküll officially or openly, but Agamben does in his text L'Aperto, where he also speaks about bare life. So this has nothing to do with all of this, except that it's an interesting word, bare. You know, what does bare mean?
The German is bloß.
Bloß.
It comes from Walter Benjamin. It's das bloßes Leben. That's where Agamben gets it from. It's originally Walter Benjamin.
Yes, and he is the expert of Benjamin for Italy. He's the translator of Benjamin.
Yeah.
And so of all of Benjamin is
Also
Agamben.
in German would mean only.
Yeah, it's life at the sort of what we would say it's barest.
Minimum, yes.
It's
yes.
minimum, which
So Benjamin uses bare, meaning naked,
no,
or
just
only,
meaning minimum.
only. Yes, but in English we use the word bare to mean also without clothes.
Yeah, but it's not. It's like the barest sliver of this. It's a kind of.
But isn't it interesting then? It's even more interesting, this entanglement of things, because Benjamin uses minimum, and Benjamin uses a word which is not bare and not etymologically connected to bare. What did you say it was? Bloß? Bloß, yes.
Das bloße Leben.
Yes, das bloße Leben, like los but bloß, yes, das bloße Leben. So, but that's not related etymologically to the word bare, in no way, because there's no way that the L can become R in any history of Germanic philosophy. But bare in English is the translation of the German. So when Benjamin was translated into English, it was used bare. And bare in English is coming from meaning nude, I think. So we should look at. It's interesting that blouse is related to blouse, which is the opposite of bare, because you're closed. You're not closed. You're clothed with a blouse. It's interesting. So now we should look up the etymology of bare for a moment. But she is using it is in naked. She is bringing it in as in the sense of naked, because now she wants to.
It's because she's writing in English and she can.
Yes, she can. So she is not referring to Agamben. So it's a Germanic word. It's not a Latin word. I'm not very strong on that. Well, anyway, we'll find it. And in the meantime, we're reading about the bare point particle. In particular, there is an infinity associated with the bare point particle. That is, with the perverse assumption we started with, that there is only an electron, the undressed, bare electron, and the void. So we started with the Democritus idea of the universe being made of particles that are suspended in a void, which, of course, very early on in classical physics was rejected. And we're going to get now to nakedness. Okay, the void. Footnote number 13. Bare, undressed, and dressed are part of the official technical language, I guess, of quantum physics. I am not making up my own metaphorical terms to help make this more accessible. In technical language, the infinity I am talking about here refers to the bare parameters in the Lagrangian or field equations. So they're called bare parameters. Yes, so the cancellation goes this way. The infinity of the bare point particle cancels the infinity associated with the cloud of virtual particles, quote unquote. In this way, the bare point particle is dressed by the vacuum contribution, that is, the cloud of virtual particles. The dressed electron, the physical electron, is thereby renormalized, that is, made normal, finite. I am using technical language here. Renormalization is the mathematical handling, taming of these infinities. That is, the infinities are subtracted from one another, yielding a finite answer. Mathematically speaking, this is a tour de force. In her footnote, she writes, Actually, to put it this way is a bit of a fudge. I like that. The renormalized or redefined parameters which replace the bare ones are not calculable by the theory, but rather are written in using the experimental values. This gives it the feel of a shell game, like putting a shell around something, no matter how mathematically sophisticated it is. Once the renormalized charge and mass are put into the theory, this is the footnote, other kinds of quantities can theoretically be derived and compared with experimentation. So back to this. So we're dressing the bare particle in order to make it mathematically usable, I guess. Mathematically speaking, this is a tour de force. Conceptually, it is a queer theorist's delight. It shows that all of matter in its essence, quote unquote, of course, that is precisely what is being troubled here, is a massive overlaying. A massive overlaying. Of virtual particle and not so dressing each other over and over. No doubt, the fact that this subtraction of two infinities can be handled in a systematic way that yields a finite value is no small achievement, and a very sophisticated mathematical machinery needed to be developed to make this possible. Nonetheless, whatever the attitude concerning the legitimacy or illegitimacy of renormalization, the mathematical operation of subtraction does not effect a conceptual cancellation. The infinities are not avoided, they are just handled. Philosophically as well as mathematically, they need to be taken into account. Renormalization is a trace of physics' ongoing self-deconstruction. This is interesting. It continually finds ways to open itself up to new possibilities, to iterative reconfigurings. Perhaps the resurfacing of infinities is a sign that the theory is vibrant and alive, not sick. I think this has something to do with what Griselda was saying about somehow, in order to grasp the physics, one needs a sort of poetics. But I think there is a constant remathematization. So it's like a challenge how to use mathematical thinking, reason, to deal with something that cannot be dealt with the mathematics that you have before. So it's a constant attempt at not taking a kind of leap of imagination, of the amateur's leap of imagination, which is more typical of, for example, art.
Yeah. But that's why she keeps saying, I'm using technical language here.
Yes.
When you think she's using some kind of analogy or some kind of literary language. But it isn't. She keeps saying, I am using technical language, because that's all you've got in one sense to explain it.
Yes. But it is an interesting kind of chasing after each other of the instrumental mind, not the instrumental mind, but the reasoning mind, to find the mathematics that will work to deal with that situation, for example. I remember that another thing that Zellinger told me one day was, well, it basically boils down to this. Either you change your definition of what reality is, or you have to believe in God. I said, okay. And he says, well, I prefer to change the way that I think about what reality is. So in a way, the idea to believe in God is like one of those leaps, you know? That wouldn't be the application of the reasoning to find the way that you can find the mathematics that can deal with that situation where reality and information basically coincide in a troubled zone where matter matters and is mattering itself and theorizing itself. So here we are to the summary. To summarize, quantum field theory radically deconstructs the classical ontology. Okay. Here are a few key points. The starting point ontology of particles and the void. Okay, Democritus. A foundational reductionist essentialism is undone by quantum field theory. It's interesting that we use essentializing also in critical theory. So this is an undoing of the essentialisms of early physics, physical models. Physical particles are inseparable from the void. This is amazing. Because it's not saying there is no void, and it's not saying There is a void, and they are separable. And that's because of the virtual particles in those interactions. Physical particles are inseparable from the void, in particular from the virtual, that's what she said. I should stop commenting. In particular from the virtual particles in the void. And the infinite plethora of alterities given by the play of quantum indeterminacies are constitutive inclusions in a radical undoing of identity. And the unknown, the insensible new realms of indeterminacy, which have incalculable effects on mattering, need to be acknowledged, or even better, taken into account. So this is where feminist new materialisms and science studies can help, I think, in the task of weaving together and not breaking with our past. Because we are very close to breaking with the discursive, language-based, postmodern positions in, for example, object-based philosophy and speculative realisms. We are very close to a naive swing from the discursive to the objectual or whatever, as if it was the only also even political route to take in this virtual world of the digital that we are enslaved by. But it's a very dangerous route to take unless one is able to also somehow queer that and complexify that as well. But if we can do that, we can weave it together and we can actually get somewhere. Yes?
I don't know, I don't want to distract.
You have to speak into
How
this.
does Wilhelm Flusser come in there, for example, with, you know, like what you
I
just
don't know.
said?
I have no idea.
Ah.
How does it?
No, because when you just talked about the discursive and then that, you know, like, okay, the discursive and then sort of after the postmodern era, that sense of going beyond language, and you just talked about the object character. I just wondered about Wilhelm Flusser, who talked
That's
very
a nice
much.
name.
He talked. He was Czech, and he's
Yes.
very. He has quite a. He's quite a figure in German media studies, more so in the German world, I think, than in
Yes.
the Anglo-Saxon world. And in publications on photography, for example, like German articles will mention him more so than American or English-speaking people. Now, Flusser, he talked very much about developments in society, where he spoke first of the image world, obviously, and then language, how we have linearity through text, etc. And then he talks about computation, the computed image, and then also how the computed image, how mathematics, algorithms has not one-dimensional, but he talks about the zero-dimensionality of that. So anyway, I just thought that's
I don't know, because I don't know his writings, but you could bring it to the next institute, or we could have a look at it. I find quite amazing that his name is Flusser.
Flusser.
Yeah, Flusser. I think that's interesting, because I always think our names somehow influence.
Wilhelm Flusser escaped
we
Nazi
Yeah.
Germany. He was from the Czech Republic.
Yes.
Went via Britain to
Yes.
South
Yeah.
America,
Yeah.
and had a fatal car crash at a symposium in Prague, in his native Prague.
Well, that's
traveling
interesting.
out.
Let's look him up.
Very, very tragic, very influential
he was born
person.
in 1920.
In
yes.
terms of also the digital image, but also he was very pro-technology, not saying technology is something that is limiting, but he could also see how that was
Yes.
a way forward.
Yes. So he's a student of Einstein. That's interesting.
And it's just in terms of thinking the image and where we are in this society.
Yes, but
with
how
its
does that relate to this?
It's when you
specifically?
talked about linearity of language, as you just. That's why I inserted Flusser.
Yes, I didn't really. I wasn't thinking about linearity of language, but this overarching discursivity
Yes.
of our last and of readings, of infinite readings.
But discursivity is text.
Yes, it is a text, and it is. Yes, it is,
In that sense.
and therefore.
And therefore, that was just going outside of that discursivity into another realm of information.
Yes, in an earlier historical period, I suppose, the period also of Marshall McLuhan. And I can't comment because I
Okay,
don't know
never
the
mind.
text, so
Yes,
how can
never
I
mind.
comment?
Yes,
I
yes.
don't know it. But I will read something, and if you would like to bring your reading of that in relation to this, I am interested. Is he being reread in ways to somehow move forward from the overbearing discursivity of our research over the last 20 years? Or is he being used for that purpose, or
he's
the
being
opposite?
used in terms of models of how to move between image and text, and in relation to what kind of position they have within society. But it's very much within theories of photography, for
Yes,
example.
I understand. Well, okay. Where are we? Well, we'll read that and we'll get to that. Okay. So
All touching entails.
everybody's touching what?
Sorry, all touch. Wait, that you wanted.
All touching entails an infinite alterity. So that touching the other, I mean, sorry, I just want to go back to this. I wouldn't want someone, I don't think that there should be what I'm trying to say is that I don't believe in a naive swing from the discursive to the material. That's a very conservative and dangerous shift going on in the art world. That's why I don't think there's an analogy between the Documenta, or a good analogy, and the Venice Biennale, the last Venice Biennale. I find very far from my way of thinking. The way that objects and materiality were brought in to that, I find it problematic. So what I'm trying to say is not say the discursive is wrong. I mean, of course, on est parlé, moi la vérité je parle. And of course, this is, but it is in the way that she's queering the materialisms. And she's saying basically that matters are also discursive bodies, and discourse is also subatomic particles going, and that there's this interaction going on. So it's more that I find useful in these texts and in these thinkers, because they allow us to not throw away all of the incredible baggage of also post-Lacanian work in what is a too easy swing from a constructivism position to a realist position. And in fact, one of her essays is called, I don't know if I gave it to you, but one of her essays is called Going Beyond the Constructivist Dichotomy. No, an earlier text of hers, but I have it somewhere here. I would like to just give you the title of it. Before she wrote that book, she wrote this essay. Here it is. This essay, Meeting the Universe Halfway, which then gives the title to the book. But the subtitle of this essay is Realism and Social Constructivism Without Contradiction. So that was like the beginning of her trying to think through this. 1996.
Could I just intervene just in my kind of role as a facilitator in one sense, which is I think what Andrea's raising is obviously there's one set of debates which are to do with the question of a certain dominance of the linguistic over the imagistic.
Which is
and
what
also in one sense what Willem Flusser is dealing with is how do the machines that we use set the parameters such that we are, as it were, machined in the ways that we interact with the world, rather the ways people think they pick up a camera and take a picture,
Yes.
but in a sense the camera
is picking us up
is
as well.
is machining us.
Yes.
In a so there's a certain interesting kind of set, and he really has had an impact on the philosophy of photography, and I've used him in thinking about trying to propose that Avi Warburg produced photography philosophically, not just as a documentary thing. So there's a conversation I think to be had there. On the other hand, I think if any of you have contact with the American Academy, there will be three things. One is that the speed with which the American Academy en masse moves from one camp to another. So either this is good or this is bad.
Yes.
So constructivism, so particularly in feminism, social construction of gender absolutely dominates. If you even raise the question that might be something else that we've discovered in our seminar around sexual difference, you are immediately cast into the outer darkness of utter essentialist stupidity. How could you be so backward? That happened in the 80s or the 70s, okay? So we're also now in physics, so we're finding this a different thing because there is another set of parameters about sort of construction versus realism, which I don't think is the same as social constructionism and essentialism, let's say in feminist theory, right? But certainly we are talking about different kinds of turns. So we talked about the linguistic turn, which encompasses structuralism, semiotics, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and then there's the affective turn, which is where everybody says, which is when they will become interested in Deleuze and affection, and a kind of different thing. And this is the problem, how to steer a course in the enormous generative creativity of thinkers without finding yourself having to decide, am I up to date? Are we, which turn should I be on? And they all happen in a very fast way. So I think what we're trying to catch up is how you keep certain kinds of conversations, which obviously, have their fields, and then where this kind of Hermes, this figure of, not the demon, but whoever brought up Hermes, which is this sort of messenger who can come between them. But definitely we are in a phase where there's a kind of tendency towards putting away and denouncing the gains of the structuralist, post-structuralist
that's what I'm
thing.
worried about.
People no longer read Lacan. I had a student the other day who said, I'm afraid to use the word ideology. And I thought, well, it's as if we've lost everything that the last 30 years produced, even while the process of continuously re-examining and deconstructing where we got to is being pressurized by the fact that the world is happening so much. I mean, the things that we are trying to think about, shall we say, the historical social materialism, is happening, changing the world, etc. So I think what you're trying to say about not letting us find ourselves in swinging, but trying to bring certain things into the conversation which keep expanding our things.
But I think that's what Karen Barad is doing, actually.
Yeah.
But if you swing backwards and forwards anyway, that's a very unmaterial way of dealing with your material. So, I mean, the thing is, that the people who are thinking about this stick absolutely to their material and let their material think them, enable what they think, enable them to think what they're thinking. It's when you depart from your material in an either or move, okay, without letting the material move you onto your next move, that you get the swing. So it's a very unmaterial way of dealing with whatever the next thing is that comes along, because it's a break from where you were, rather than a move that at real thinking, you have to allow yourself to be thought by the next move, in a sense. You can't do the jump because you're materially breaking from thinking.
Yeah, the throwing out of ideas, and it just get kind of brought to mind the Kleinian kind of ideas, and now the reparation and the kind of repairing.
Did you speak about Melanie Klein?
I think that, briefly, but I read
Yes.
A lot previously
That's
as well.
Wonderful. Tomorrow we must go into that, absolutely, or even today. What was the relationship between that and what we're doing now?
Just the idea of this kind of disparaging or discounting previous things, kind of disavowing ideas, and then having to reconstruct them somehow and put them back together again when you realise that they're kind of a bit useful. This kind of object relation kind of way.
But I wouldn't say that Karen Barad belongs to a simple materialist turn. I mean, if you read Jane Bennett, if you read Samantha Frost and other authors who are in this so-called materialist turn, you might get that impression that there's a kind of denial, that there's this throwing out. But I think Barad is interesting because she holds it all. Because of quantum physics, it's possible to hold it all, as opposed to go in one direction or another. So it's a good exercise in holding it all, I think. Is that what we're talking about?
I wasn't suggesting she was talking about throwing out. I'm just saying
Yeah.
in relation to you're talking about the swing from one camp to another. That's
Yes.
kind of.
But some of them are. I think we should read Jane Bennett, because as much as I love Jane Bennett, it's almost like, it's like a revolutionary push towards the only thing that thinks in the world is matter. The electrical grid thinks. It thinks us. It makes us. So it's a complete swing to, away from the discursive. So it's.
By the way she uses language that she's interested in.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Sorry, I mean, that's what's noticeable about this, is the care with which she uses language to try and hold what she's trying to say.
Yes.
So she's obviously really interested in the discursive, because it's allowing her to say this apart from anything else.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and she's telling us how there are the languages, the vertical part, the virtual particle, or the dressing of it, that is also a language of matter and materials themselves.
I'm talking in technical terms when it seems like she's using
metaphor,
everyday terms or metaphor, because the quantum physicists have to use metaphor at some point because they can't say it.
The models, they take that's very poetic, to take these words that for example, the cloud, which then went from physics to the commerce to our so-called cloud.
But then in a sense it stops being a metaphor at that point when they take it on.
When the corporations of communications take it on, it's proposed as a metaphor,
and it becomes a brand.
but it's a cage. But they take it from the way that first it went from the cloud to physics, and then from physics to the corporation of communications.
I want to suggest we go to the end
Yes.
of the section and then have another tea break, because
Yes.
the coffee's waiting.
Okay,
outside.
so where were we?
All touching entails enterity.
Yes, so that touching the other is touching all others, including the self, and touching the self entails touching the strangers within. Even the smallest bits of matter are an unfathomable multitude. Each individual always already includes all possible interactions with itself through all the virtual others, including those that are non-contemporaneous with itself. That is, that's interesting, speaking about time and time. That is, every finite being is always already threaded through with an infinite alterity, diffracted through being and time. This is the relationship with finitude, which is much more complex than after finitude, relationship with finitude. Indeterminacy is an undoing of identity that unsettles the very foundations of non-being. Together with Derrida, we might then say that, quote, identity can only affirm itself as identity to itself by opening itself to the hospitality of a difference from itself, or of a difference with itself. Condition of the self, such a difference from and with itself, would then be its very thing, the stranger at home. Individuals are infinitely indebted to all others, where indebtedness is about not a debt that follows or results from a transaction, but rather a debt that is the condition of possibility of giving and receiving. It's interesting that she just mentioned Derrida, but in the only time that Derrida speaks about debt in his text about time, I think, he says there is no gift, or there is no gift, there is only debt, because the only gift is the gift of life, that where you don't know that it is given to you, because any other gift is the creation of a debt. So in his musings on Marcel Mauss and gifts and debts. In a chapter on touching, Jean-Luc Nancy titled To Self-Touch You, in a chapter of On Touching, Jean-Luc Nancy titled To Self-Touch You, Derrida touches on and troubles the account Jean-Luc Nancy gives of sense as touching. He remarks that self-touching in no way reduces the alterity of the other who comes to inhabit the self-touching, or at least to haunt it, at least as much as it spectralizes any experience of touching the other. So we're back with the ghosts. Ontological indeterminacy a radical openness, an infinity of possibilities, is at the core of mattering. How strange that indeterminacy in its infinite openness is the condition for the possibility of all structures in their dynamically reconfiguring instabilities. This is why yesterday I wanted to touch on dust and clay and sedimentation and the vase and all of that, to see that infinite openness at the core of what we call the object, to see it as this provisional moment in this, not a linear time flux, but all the moments of that time that are together in that instability. It's kind of like Star Trek and teleportation. Matter in its iterative materialization, matter in its iterative, so in its repeated, in its iterative materialization is a dynamic play of indeterminacy. Matter is never a settled matter. I think that's the point. Matter is never a settled matter. It is always already radically open. Closure cannot be secured when the conditions of impossibilities and lived indeterminacies are integral, not supplementary, to what matter is. Together with Haraway, we might ask, whom and what do we touch when we touch electrons? And the footnote, Haraway writes, whom and what do I touch when I touch my dog? Yeah. Yes, because she's riffing off of Derrida. Or rather, and by the way, just to one more last thing about the dog question, that Griselda's point about the working dogs, it is indeed amazing how many increased jobs are being given to non-human animals again. And this is an increase which is bringing us closer to a pre-modern era as well, when there was much more collaboration between species in agriculture, in our daily lives. And it is also a very respectful, I mean, some people see this as a form of enslaving, but it is, I think, not a form of enslaving. It is a form of freeing, that the food is also connected with this exchanges of labors and the possibility of labor and so on. So the dog question, or rather in decentering and deconstructing the us in the very act of touching as intra-action, we might put the question this way. When electrons meet each other halfway, when they interact with one another, when they touch one another, whom or what do they touch? In addition to all the various iteratively reconfiguring ways that electrons, indeed all material entities, are entangled relations of becoming, there is also the fact that materiality itself is always already touched by and touching infinite configurations of possible others, other beings and times. In an important sense, in a breathtakingly intimate sense, touching, sensing, is what matter does. Or rather, what matter is. Matter is condensations of response ability. Touching is a matter of response. Each of us is constituted in response ability. Each of us is constituted as responsible for the other as the other. And this is the, again, brings us to a little bit the bracha question, bracha ideas, but also to the subconscious, let's say, of the text with the jug, you know, the question of that there is no jug without the holding of it.